Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Shane and I'm delighted to be joined by Damien Margaritis, Technical Solutions Professional in Lync Technology Australia, who will be talking to you today about video interop with Microsoft Teams. Remember to join the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC21. Don't forget to check out the Resource Center. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit SharePointEurope.com and click the content link at the top. ESPC 21 Online will take place on the 1st and 2nd of June 2021. Be part of this event and register today at SharePointEurope.com for free. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you have for Damien in the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded and will be added to the Resource Center, where you'll be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter, Damien Margaritis. Hello, Damien.
Perfect. Hello, and thank you very much, everyone that has joined us for the webinar this morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are in the world. So let's get right into it. Video interop with Microsoft Teams. For anyone that would like to get in contact with me after this session, I've got some contact details here. You can find me on Twitter at dmunified. I do have a blog as well at dmunified.com. And if you do happen to reside in Australia, I am heavily involved with the Melbourne and Brisbane Skype and Teams user groups that I run here on behalf of Microsoft. So if you are in Australia, please do come along. So let's get into it. So first up, a little bit on the journey. So when I first started getting into the world of unified comms, or I guess more VoIP back then and video conferencing, we had a world that was very much separate. We had, it was pretty common for me to deploy systems like this on the left, this 3Com VoIP SIP-based system, which is the SIP protocol. And on the right-hand side, we've got Tandberg systems, which of course became Cisco after some time. But we had these two environments. One was using SIP and one was using H.323. And those two worlds didn't really cross boundaries, so to speak. Of course, so when we were deploying video conferencing units from these various vendors, we often talked about standards-based video conferencing endpoints. And when we mean standards-based, we mean an endpoint that's running standard SIP protocol or standard H.323 protocol. I've got some examples here from from vendors like Polycom and Lifesize and Cisco, etc., that had a very similar flavor of SIP or H.323 that was running under the hood in order for them to communicate. So what do we actually mean by standards-based? So the term standards-based really refers to any video conferencing endpoint that uses either SIP or H.323 to communicate with other endpoints using SIP or H.323. And they didn't necessarily have to be from the same vendor. So if they are using a standard, I should be able to do things like go to a Poly endpoint and call through to a Cisco endpoint, for example. Now, in practice, we know this isn't always the case, and we have back-end infrastructure to help us get calls to route from point A to point B. But in essence, this is what standards-based was meant to mean. Of course, moving forward, I started to then get into the Microsoft Lync world, right? This is where we really started to see unified communications from a Microsoft perspective really start to take off. So it's really common to deploy Microsoft's flavor of SIP, and I should point out that it wasn't a standards-based SIP protocol, it was Microsoft's flavor of SIP. So a little bit different than the standard SIP-based protocol. And then on the other side of the fence, I would still often have my Polycom endpoints or my Cisco endpoints running H.323, and I needed some way to interface those together. And we would often deploy some infrastructure from companies like Polycom, HexIP, Acano, which of course was purchased by Cisco not too long ago, actually a few years ago now. But we would put something in the middle of these two worlds to act as a bridge or a proxy between these two environments. What this would allow me to do is to use a Microsoft Lync client to make a video call and answer it on a H.323 endpoint or vice versa, or to join conferences on different platforms. Right? And now this is still valid in some use cases, but as you'll see as we move forward, it's a little bit more complicated today when we talk about video interop as we move into Microsoft's new platform, Microsoft Teams. And of course, this model stayed more or less the same when we went from Lync server to Sky for Business server, which was more or less the same architecture with some different codecs and things like that, but still under the hood was using the same Microsoft SIP protocol. Okay, so at this point, we've got HTTP on one side still, Microsoft SIP on the other. We have something in the middle that allows us to interface between those two worlds. And looking at Poly as a bit more of a closer example, it was pretty common for us to stand up Polycom infrastructure side by side with Sky for Business infrastructure, side by side with all the perimeter network infrastructure required that would allow a Sky for Business and Lync environment and standards-based environments to communicate with each other. Okay, and this is where we're able to do things like cascading, as this is showing here, where I could cascade video feeds and content from one environment into the other. And for the end user, it would more or less be presented as if they wouldn't know that that video was coming in from a different environment. It would just present in the Skype meeting as another little floating box of video, and vice versa on the other side. And when we deployed these solutions, the way that this integration actually worked was it was all powered by the meeting invite itself. So if I had a new Skype meeting invite in this example, and I deployed all that Polycom infrastructure in the back end to do some interop, some real connect, clarity, that type of thing, it would add this text to my meeting invite that I sent to somebody at the far end. And this would allow that person at the far end to walk up to their standards-based video conferencing endpoint, enter in this join link here, this join URI, enter the conference ID, and join my meeting. Fantastic. I've got a standards-based endpoint to get into my Sky for Business meeting. So now I had external HTTP meeting participants joining my Lync or Sky for Business server meetings, and I also had in my own internal HTTP endpoints joining my Lync or Sky for Business server meetings. So far, so good. But of course, as we moved to Sky for Business Online, we needed a solution that would be able to do this, but we didn't necessarily want all the on-premises infrastructure. So one of the first to do that in 2017 was Poly with their Real Connect for Office 365 platform. And this was based on Sky for Business. So this is before Teams existed, okay? And this enabled non-native standards-based video conferencing endpoints to join Sky for Business online meetings using infrastructure that Polycom had deployed into Azure, into the cloud, okay? So I could consume this service as a license. I could buy a license. It would actually be presented as a first-class license into my Office 365 tenant that I can associate to a user. And when I did that, similar to the on-premises integration that I showed earlier, it would add some additional text to the meeting invite. As you see here, someone could walk up to their standards-based endpoint and dial a SIP string in this example and get into my Sky for Business online meeting. Fantastic. So now we had a cloud-based solution for this. So this really solved two main problems when we had this. If I was moving to Sky for Business Online and had investment in my on-premises standards-based endpoints, as you see here, I could basically proxy through that Polycom core in the cloud to get to Sky for Business Online meetings. But it also meant that if I just wanted external participants to be able to join my Sky for Business meetings, let's say someone that I do business with at company X has Cisco endpoints and they wanted to join my Sky for Business Online meetings, they could do so. They could get the meeting invite, they could enter that URI, they could enter in the conference ID and get access to my Sky for Business meeting. Okay, fantastic. And this brings us up to around 2017. But of course, we had Microsoft Teams released in 2017. Okay, this was brand new architecture. It was not based on Sky for Business Online. There's technically no SIP HTTP under the hood with Teams, right? It's a brand new platform that Microsoft built. And as it wasn't based on SIP or HTTP, how do we handle interop now? Now it's not as simple as having a gateway that sits between two worlds or some integration software or servers that sit between two environments. How do we handle interop? So when I talk to organizations about this, the first thing I always want to find out is what can we do out of the box with Teams and what can we do with some of the extensibility that I'm going to show you. But the first question is, do I even need interop? Okay. So before diving into those interop options, it's really important to understand what your organization's specific use cases are, and then work back from there to develop your meeting room device strategy and your interop strategy from there, okay? If your organization meets the following criteria, you may not need interop at all. If your meetings are scheduled for internal staff only, not all that common, but in some organizations, it's all internal meetings. So as long as people can have Teams and have access to that and have Teams native rooms, there's no real need for Interop. The second one is your organization itself controls the scheduling of meetings, and external participants join via a web browser, their own Teams client, or dial in from a PSTN number. And all of that is supported by the standard meetings invite that we see here, with just one caveat that, of course, we need to have the audio conferencing license if we want to be able to call into a Teams meeting using a PSTN phone, right? Good old-fashioned PSTN access, which is still the lowest common denominator for a lot of organizations, making sure people can always dial a phone number because it's the most available technology around the world, okay? Now, if we actually click on that find a local number, it'll give us a list of about 90 countries from around the world that we can dial to get into our meeting. So this is what we see in a standard invite. And of course, paired with that, we want to be using native devices in our meeting rooms. If we don't need Interop, we of course need to have native Microsoft Teams meeting rooms. Here we're showing Surface Hub and the Microsoft Teams room system on Windows. I'm going to show you some devices a bit later on, which is Microsoft Teams room systems on Android. What were the collaboration bars, but that is also an option available to you today. So just sticking with the question of, do I even need Interop? One of the use cases might actually be that you just want native Teams meeting join between organizations. So you can join another organization's Teams meetings from your own native Teams devices and vice versa. Some configuration is required. Now in the screen grab, what I'm showing you here is a company meeting that I've sent to a Microsoft Teams room system that's based on Windows. I've sent an invite from another company. So Dell, who works for a different company, has sent a meeting directly to my meeting room. And this one, Adele actually sent me the meeting invite for her Teams meeting, and I forwarded it to the Microsoft Teams room system myself. So those scenarios are supported with Microsoft Teams room on Windows devices out of the box, except with that configuration, a couple of things you need to check in your mailbox configuration. You need to make sure that comments is not being deleted, but this one here is more important, this process external meeting messages, okay? So if we want to accept meeting invites from people outside the organization, we need to have that on, okay? And if you are not from the technical side of the equation, then please reach out to your technical teams that can help you with this type of thing. So getting through all that, let's assume that we do actually want some cloud video interop, which is, I'm guessing, why a lot of you are here today. So first up, what is Cloud Video Interop for Microsoft Teams? So Cloud Video Interop is a cloud-based Microsoft qualified solution that enables standards-based meeting room devices to join Microsoft Teams meeting. And just to reiterate what those devices are, whether it be a Polycom group series, as you see in this picture, or a Cisco device or a Lifesize device, and they will be running standards-based SIP or H323. Typically H323 is what we see, okay? Now the architecture, how does this actually work? So on one side, we have our SIP or H323 video conferencing endpoint that we want to be able to join our Microsoft Teams meeting. And of course, on the other side, we've got Microsoft Teams. What Cloud Video Interop is, it's actually made up of a couple of components, but one of them is a Teams Interop bot that Microsoft has developed that always lives in Azure, okay? So this lives in Azure and is doing a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to getting SIP or H323 endpoints into a Microsoft Teams meeting. But we also have additional partner capabilities that typically live in Azure, but sometimes can live in their own data centers or in their own servers on-prem in some of these instances, particularly now Cisco are in the mix. But basically, Microsoft gave this Teams Interop bot to 4 partners at time of this webinar: Poly, BlueJeans, Pexip, and Cisco. They all have slightly different flavors of their product and how it's wrapped and how it's priced and things like that. But this piece always remains the same. We have an Interop bot in Azure, and together with the additional partner capabilities, allows these standards-based devices to get into a Microsoft Teams meeting. Full audio, full video, full application sharing in both directions when this is deployed. How is it presented to your users? Okay, what do your users see when you have something like this deployed? Well, as you can see here, earlier on you saw the meeting invite with some text at the top, so the usual join link for a Teams meeting, optionally the audio conferencing link down here. And then if we have something like Cloud Video Interop deployed, we actually get this bit of additional text that appears in our meeting invite. So similar to how we used to do it on premises, or similar to how we used to do it with Real Connect in the Sky for Business days before Real Connect for Teams or other cloud video interop providers, we have this link that someone can dial from a standards-based endpoint to get into our Microsoft Teams meeting. Okay, this example here is one of the older looking invites, and in this case is a BlueJeans link, but similar use case, right? If somebody does actually click on this little link here, alternate VTC dialing instructions, it will also give you some additional things that can be dialed in different formats that might help someone at the far end get into your Microsoft Teams meeting from their endpoint of choice. So whether it's Polycom, Cisco, Lifesize, etc., they can dial that string and get into the Microsoft Teams meeting, okay? So Real Connect for Teams really solves two key scenarios, okay? I'm moving to Microsoft Teams, but I might still have an investment in standards-based endpoints, okay? Now that might be Cisco endpoints. It could be Polycom Group and Polycom Trio endpoints that I've used in an existing on-premises Sky for Business environment, for example, or even a Sky for Business Online environment, and I need those devices to be able to join my Microsoft Teams meetings, and I do that through the Cloud Video Interop service. Or it might just be externals from other organizations that I want to be able to join my Teams meetings using the Cloud Video Interop service also. So both of those use cases are supported. Moving on to one-touch dial. So as you've seen, Cloud Video Interop adds additional information to the Teams meeting invite, which can be dialed from any standards-based endpoint to join a Teams meeting. So once I get that invite, if it's been sent to me and I'm from another company, and I'm clever enough to walk up to my Cisco endpoint and know what to do with dialing that string and putting the code in to get into the meeting, happy days. I can do that. External organizations will have to do that. But we don't want our internal users having to manually dial into a Teams meeting from a non-Teams native endpoint. So if I am one of those organizations that still has internal existing non-Teams standard endpoints, so things like Cisco or Polycom Group or anything like that, I want an ability to automate that experience. So if I send a Teams meeting invite to that room, I want a button to appear on the screen that I press in order to get into the meeting, okay? And that's really what One Touch Dial does. So One Touch Dial, in this example, this is actually Polycom's One Touch Dial service. BlueJeans, Cisco, etc., they all have their own flavor of this. But basically, think of it like a man in the middle that sits between Exchange and an endpoint, whether it be Polycom or Cisco in this example, that's able to rewrite a meeting invite and push a button to the screen of the video conferencing endpoint, so someone can hit one button and join a Teams meeting, okay? So in this example, this is showing a screen grab from One Touch Dial that shows Polycom Group and Office 365, but with One Touch Dial sitting in the middle. And this join button here is actually a Microsoft Teams meeting join button. So when I've deployed One Touch Dial and I invite the room and the invite hits Office 365, One Touch Dial gets that invite, recognize it as having Real Connect for Teams meeting invite join link in it, and it actually rewrites it before pushing it to the Polycom group so that it pushes this button. If we didn't do that and we just left the endpoint getting its information directly from Exchange, and it is also supported for Exchange on-prem, not just Exchange Online that this example was showing. We push the meeting to it, it won't show the join button because the endpoint itself doesn't know what to do with a Microsoft Teams invite. It needs a combination of Real Connect for Teams in the Polycom example and the One Touch Dial that sits in the middle in order to push that button to the device. Okay. So when to use Cloud Video Interop, existing investment in standards-based endpoints. I might need to sweat that for a period of time. If I've got hundreds or even thousands for larger organizations of endpoints that are not Teams native, then I may need to hold on to those endpoints for some time, but I still need to make sure that I can join Teams meetings. One other example we've seen a lot of, kind of by accident through COVID, here in Australia, we've experienced it just as badly as some places around Europe. A lot of people were forced out of the office pretty quickly. They were forced onto Teams pretty quickly. Everyone started doing Teams meetings. Now that people in Melbourne, at least, are coming back into the office, a lot of organizations have 100-200 meeting rooms with endpoints that can't join a Teams meeting. So very quickly, they need to solve that problem. Cloud Video Interop can solve that problem for you. Your organization might want to deploy Teams as a meeting platform, but not quite ready to swap out standards-based meeting room devices. There might also be the requirement in your organization to support outbound dialing to another standards-based SIP or H323 conference. That still might be a use case that is valid in your organization. So for example, I've worked with organizations that have moved completely to Microsoft Teams native meeting rooms. But one thing I can't do with Cloud Video Interop is dial out from a Microsoft Teams room to a standards-based H323 endpoint or standard SIP endpoint. Can't do that. So in order to support those outbound dialing requirements to somebody else's standards-based endpoint, they've kept a number of rooms in different geographic locations that are actually set up as a kind of like a hybrid device that can still join Teams meetings using Cloud Video Interop, but remain a standards-based endpoint in order to make that outbound call to somebody else's environment. Okay, that's a valid use case. Or I might be migrating from Skype for Business to Teams within your organization. You've utilized Poly's Group and Trio series, pretty common audio video endpoints for Microsoft Skype for Business on-prem and online. I might still need to support that use case while introducing the ability to join Teams meetings as well. We can also do that with Cloud Video Interop. These devices stay registered to Skype for Business on premises or Skype for Business online, but also I can add Cloud Video Interop to it, and these devices are also capable of dialing out through the Cloud Video Interop service into a Microsoft Teams meeting. Now, for anyone out there that might have a big investment in Trios, Poly Trios, so with Visual Plus or Pro. So if you're using Trio as an audio video device and not just an audio only device, and you want to use that to join Teams meetings, then you use Cloud Video Interop to do this. What we can also do with the Trios is actually support multiple platforms on these devices. So we can have a, let's say we were still using the device with Skype for Business. We can use it with Skype for Business. We can have another line on the device for Real Connect, so joining Teams meetings. And we can actually have another button for Zoom, BlueJeans, etc. We can actually have multiple registrations on the device, well, not registrations, one registration is usually what we have, and then a couple other platforms that are supported. And when I receive a meeting invite for that meeting platform, I hit one button and it uses that Interop capability to join that Zoom or Teams meeting in this example, okay? A one-touch dial is not required for Trios. We don't need that man in the middle between Exchange and the actual Trio devices. The Trios are clever enough to know what to do with the invite, okay? Now, just on the licensing side, so as I pointed out earlier with the meeting invite for Real Connect Teams in this example, or for Cloud Video Interop, or generally, you'll see that we get this link added to the device. Similarly for Zoom, if we're going to support Interop from a Polycom Trio device, in particular in this example, we need to ensure that we've got this joined by SIP link that is added to our Zoom meeting invites, because that's what the Trio is looking for when it wants to do Interop and join a Zoom meeting using an Interop service. And this is a paid component that you have to add to Zoom in order to add this capability, okay? But once you actually have that, now this is a little bit of an eye chart, but basically some configuration from a Polycom Trio. And basically what this is trying to show is a couple of additional lines that are set up for Teams and Zoom, as shown here, Teams and Zoom. And you'll see we're looking for a specific address, t.plstem.vc in the case of Polycom Real Connect. And then down here, zoomcrc.com is associated with this third button. So button 2, button 3. And we actually have some regular expression mapping here as well, so that when I hit that join button, it knows which one to use. But you can see here, this is why we need to have this text to appear in the Zoom meeting invite in particular, right? Because it says zoomcrc.com. It needs to match in the configuration on the Trio once we've actually pushed a button to these devices, okay? So there's a little bit of config required in order to make these work. Just keep that in mind. If you want more info on this, please do feel free to reach out to me. I do have some configs I'd be happy to share with you. So some limitations of Cloud Video Interop. So Cloud Video Interop does not support ad hoc dialing from a standards-based endpoint to a Teams endpoint, okay? Scheduled meetings only. So I can't walk up to a standards-based video conferencing endpoint and dial into a Teams meeting or dial an individual Teams user. It's not designed for that. It's only for scheduled meetings. Just keep that in mind. The CVI enables standards-based endpoints to dial into Microsoft Teams meetings, but it does not enable Teams to dial out to a standards-based endpoint or room. It's a one-way integration, okay? So it only allows me to go into my Teams meeting. So Teams is always at the center and devices are coming into my Teams meeting. I'm not going out to somebody else's platform. Okay, so just to finish up with, we want to talk a little bit about direct guest join. So from what you've seen there, we've talked a lot about cloud video interop, which really solved the problem of standards-based video conferencing endpoints, whether it be SIP or H323, getting into my Microsoft Teams meeting, okay? Or it meant that I could get into a Zoom meeting using a standards-based integration, right? Which we're still talking SIP and H323. But of course, in today's world, if we actually look at things like a Zoom or Webex or anything like that, we've moved away from those standards somewhat, and Teams as well. So Teams doesn't kind of adhere to a SIP or H323 protocol standard. So how do I handle interop with those, between those worlds? So the good news is that we do have this thing called direct guest join, and it's almost like Microsoft Zoom and Cisco are all playing nicely together. And basically what this means is that I can join a Webex or a Zoom meeting from a Microsoft Teams room system natively. I'll talk a bit more about that in a sec. And I can also join a Microsoft Teams meeting from a Webex or Zoom room system. So the kind of white flag has gone up and everyone's playing nicely in order for us to use each other's endpoints to join our meetings, okay? Now in the Microsoft space, this is what it can look like. So in this example, you can see I've got a native Microsoft Teams meeting here, a Webex meeting here, and a Zoom meeting here, all on the same Microsoft Teams room system, okay? Which is the Windows-based Microsoft Teams room system. More on that in a second. And what this actually allows us to do is walk up to a device, hit the button for our Webex or Zoom meeting, and the actual experience for Webex or Zoom actually takes over the device. So rather than us going through an Interop service to support this, the way this is actually working is on the Microsoft Teams room system, which is a Windows-based device, there is a web app running for Zoom and a web app running for Webex. When I hit that button to join a Zoom or Webex meeting, it's actually bringing that client to the front, and either Zoom native experience or Webex native experience takes over the Microsoft Teams room experience. So I don't actually need to go through an Interop service for this to work. I don't need to worry about Interop licenses or anything like that. I can just do this directly from the endpoint. So if I don't need that standards-based SIP or H323 and all I care about is getting into a Zoom meeting or a Webex meeting from a native Microsoft Teams room system panel, I can do that. That's available today. Okay. A couple of things you need to make it work: a Microsoft Teams room system running Windows, so the Windows-based solutions, the most up-to-date software, and it needs to be enabled. So this screen grab is from the Microsoft Teams Admin Center, where I've gone and looked at the settings on a Microsoft Teams room system, and you'll see that we can actually tick those settings now from the back end, from the Microsoft Teams Admin Center, rather than actually doing it from the device itself, okay? So that needs to be enabled. There needs to be some settings on calendar processing just to make sure that we're not deleting subject and comments and things like that. And the reason why is that when we send that meeting invite to the resource mailbox that's associated with that Microsoft Teams room system device, we need to make sure that we're able to process that external message and they're not deleting any of the important text that the endpoint actually passes when it's looking for any invites from other platforms. So if these are set to true, it'll actually delete the Cisco Webex or the Zoom link. By the time it gets to the panel, it doesn't know that it's a Zoom or Webex meeting. Therefore, no button appears on the device. Okay, so this is important. The other one to look out for is ATP, so safe links, so advanced threat protection. If you are using safe links capabilities of ATP, again, if it's being rewritten, that Webex or Zoom link before it actually gets to the endpoint, then the endpoint's not going to be able to recognize it and then push a button to the screen of the device for you to one button click to join. So if you're using ATP, you need to make sure that, or safe links in particular, that you've got an exclusion list set up for that. Good friend Graham Walsh over at Crestron has actually written a great blog where he talks about this and has some links that are useful for you to go and check out for that. But this is basically all you need for that to work from a Microsoft Teams room system running Windows. Now on that, we are now seeing something called Microsoft Teams Room on Android, or shortened there, MTROA. You may have already seen these as known as collaboration bars for Microsoft Teams. So initially when these devices came out, there was the Poly X30 and X50 up here that came out, and Lync had some models as well. But basically these were devices that were designed for audio and video in a meeting room, but they run Android. They're not running Windows under the hood. So today we've actually got a lot more devices that fit into this category, and as such, Microsoft don't call them collaboration bars anymore. They've actually come under the Microsoft Teams Room system family name. So now we have this concept of Microsoft Teams Room on Windows and Microsoft Teams Room on Android. The devices that run Microsoft Teams Room on Android, such as these, do not today have the ability to do Zoom or Webex join from the device itself. So if you have that requirement, if you want to be able to join Zoom or Webex meetings from your Microsoft Teams Room systems, you need to invest in the Windows-based solutions today. That may change in the future. There may be some work in the future where third-party meeting join into Zoom or Webex will also work from these Android-based video conferencing solutions. But today, you have to use the Windows-based option, okay? But expect to see these become more and more popular, particularly given that they're all-in-one devices, so I don't have to have a separate kind of PC NUC. Although interestingly down here, Logitech have actually released an Android-based kind of PC unit that can be used for Teams meetings, as well as Zoom meetings natively, etc. But if you have it in Teams mode, it's a Teams meeting device. They can be paired with some of their devices. So there's going to be more happening in that Android space, and more features are being added in order to bring them closer to parity with the Microsoft Teams Room on Windows experience that we've had for some time. Okay. And that brings me to the end of the slides. So happy to open it to questions and answers if I have them for you.
Great stuff, Felix. Oh, sorry, Felix. I'm looking at a question from Felix. My apologies, Damien.
That's okay.
First question is from Felix. Considering the cost of Interop licenses and hardware, wouldn't it be more cost effective to change all meeting room devices with Microsoft Teams Room devices like the Logitech Rally?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it depends, right? So if you look at a lot of meeting rooms, for example, from say Polycom Group or the big Cisco rooms, there might be rooms that have $100,000, $200,000 fit out in a room, multiple cameras, AV integration, recording solutions, you name it. We've seen some pretty crazy rooms out there, which have ultimately been also registered to Sky for Business to be used, or it could have just been a Cisco room. So to actually rip and replace that room and turn it into a native Microsoft Teams room can be quite cost prohibitive, but also technically very difficult because it's a completely different platform. So the Microsoft Teams Room solutions, like they don't have API integrations for like AV control and things like that the standards-based endpoints tended to have. So for a lot of those rooms, it's just cost prohibitive or technically prohibitive to actually do what you're saying. The other thing is, for a lot of organizations, again, if they've got a massive investment in non-Teams native rooms, whilst some of the solutions out there have got pretty cheap, it can still be pretty expensive if you need to refresh hundreds of rooms as opposed to just one or two. So we often find that organizations that we work with, kind of phase one is cloud video interop, so that they can continue to use their existing investments to join Teams meetings, whilst they then start going down the path of what's our strategy to actually move to native Microsoft Teams rooms and start ticking those off. But they don't have to worry about the fact they can't join Teams meetings in the short to medium term because they have something like Cloud Video Interop in the mix.
Okay, next question. Can I use Surface Hub to direct guest join?
It's a great question. No, today you cannot. So the only devices that support direct guest join, and just to reiterate, direct guest join is using Webex or Zoom from a Microsoft Teams Room native device and to join a Zoom or Webex meeting. The only devices that are supported for that are the Microsoft Teams Room system on Windows. It's the only one you can use.
Okay, we have a few people asking, how does licensing work for CVI?
Sure. So with Cloud Video Interop, it's based on a concurrency model. So let's say I have, you would have seen in the slides earlier that the way that it's presented to the end user, and I'll bring the slide up just to make it easier. Bear with me. Here we go. So for that bit of text to appear, there's a policy that we deploy and say, okay, these 100 people, 1,000 people, everyone in my company gets this bit of text to appear. But as far as paying for the licensing goes, you typically pay on concurrency. So I might buy 10 licenses or 20 licenses or 50 licenses, but I might give 1,000 people the ability to show this text. It just means that at any one time, only 5, 10, 20 standards-based endpoints can be joining my Teams meetings at any one time. Then you typically pay per license per year. There is also some of the cloud video interop providers also have a license per month cost as well. You can do that. But a lot of them, so Poly Real Connect, for example, we typically sell that as a 1 port per year, which in Australia is about 12 or 1,300 Australian dollars per year. And depending on how many concurrent standards-based endpoints they want to join at any one time, that's what you're paying for.
Okay, here's a follow-up question to a previous one from Felix. In the old world, we had, for example, the Poly Resource Manager to have control over all video devices, i.e. updates, backgrounds, usage reports, support. Is there any similar control option with Interop and or with MTR systems?
Yeah, it's a good question. So on the back end of, from your Microsoft Teams admin portal, there's the ability to manage Microsoft Teams meeting room devices. So today I can see if it's online or offline, I can reboot them, I can change the settings and things like that. There is also something called Microsoft Teams Room Premium, which is kind of like a managed service from Microsoft where they're actually monitoring your room devices for you as well. There's also going to be something else that appears in the Teams admin portal for free, so you won't have to pay for a more advanced license to get access to it. But at the moment in the Teams admin portal, if something's wrong, like if a screen is being disconnected or if someone unplugged a camera, it'll show you in the portal that it's offline, but it doesn't actually advise you of that. It doesn't actually, it doesn't, unless you go and look for it, it doesn't actually tell you. So you get a notification, an alert is the word I'm looking for. That's being added to the Teams admin portal as well. So Microsoft has kind of realized that they were a little bit lacking for a long time when it came to kind of back-end visibility and management of devices, particularly when you compared it to, what Poly was able to do with, their servers that could do that, Resource Manager and whatnot, and Cisco. They're kind of backfilling that. And then on top of that, you've also got, depending on which vendor you go with, so Logitech have their Sync application, which is getting more and more advanced every time we see it. Crestron, who do the Crestron Flex systems, they've got their cloud-based solution as well to monitor and manage their devices, as well as kind of go above and beyond what you can do in the Microsoft portal. So there's quite a bit out there that allows you to monitor and manage these room systems. And ideally, what Microsoft is working towards is actually doing all of this natively from the Teams admin portal. And I agree with that approach. I don't want to have to go off to a different vendor's platform to check something different. I want to be able to do it natively from within my Teams admin center. If you haven't seen it already, if you go into the Teams admin center, if you have access to that and you go and look at the Teams rooms and IP phones, you'll see Teams displays and collaboration bars, different menus in there, where you can actually go and see the health status of your devices.
Okay, what security settings do I need to change? For example, do I need to open firewall ports when deploying CVI?
Sure, so with Cloud Video Interop, if I'm using it for endpoints within my organization and I need to reach out to that Cloud Video Interop provider that's providing the interop into the Teams meeting, there's some outbound firewall ports that are required. And it differs depending on which provider you use, but typically, for example, so with Poly, with their Real Connect, I go back to that one because it's the one I'm most familiar with, so that's why I'm preferring that, but all 4 of them will have similar requirements. There's some outbound ports required for outbound SIP from a Trio endpoint, for example, so 5061, media ports, all the usual things that we would need. And the ports only need to be open outbound, because if you think about it with Cloud Video Interop, a call is never coming in from the interop service, it's always going from my endpoint out to the cloud, right? So I need to open outbound ports. So if your organization opens outbound firewall ports by default, then you don't have to worry about it. If they do block ports, except for specifics, then there are some firewall rules that need to be added to allow the signaling and media to travel out to the Interop service in the cloud.
Okay. How about troubleshooting joining problems or something like that? Is there any option at Microsoft Teams site, analytics or tools?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first place, if we're talking about Interop service itself, so again, the various cloud video interop service providers have portals that allow you to see that type of information. So for Poly, they have a kind of an analytics backend where I can go in and I can see failures and I can see why things failed if they get to the cloud. Pretty rare that I actually see any failures like that. Usually it's troubleshooting a firewall port or something like that during initial configuration. But there is the ability to see that on the back end from a cloud video interop perspective. For Teams meeting devices joining meetings, then I can go into the Teams admin portal. I can click on a Microsoft Teams room system. I can actually bring up the activity of the device. And I can see all the calls that it had. If there were failed calls, I can actually kind of drill into that until I find what the problem was. So there is that ability to do that natively from the Teams admin portal if it's a Teams native endpoint joining a meeting.
Super. That's all the questions, Damien. On behalf of the ESPC community, thank you for taking the time to complete this webinar today. We really appreciate it.
No worries. Thanks everybody for joining.
Super. And thank you, Damien. Okay, everybody, that is the end of today's webinar. Thank you for joining us today. Please do take care and goodbye.